This video is supposed to go up on New Year's Eve. I don't know if I'll manage to get this done on time, so it'll either be my last video of 2025 or the first video of 2026. Either way, it's a New Year's video. It's the time to reflect on my past year and think about my future goals. I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of in the muck trying to cope with burnout and the fragility of my body. If you're unaware, I graduated from a 2-year comic and illustration course back in June. I have a video about the process of making my thesis, which I did translate from French. The PDF should be available for purchase on my Ko-fi. It was a really intense 6-month work period that did result in me pushing myself past my limits and sustaining a pretty nasty wrist sprain in October, which took about 2 weeks to recover from. Even now, my wrist still feels a little funny sometimes. Since graduation, I've desperately wanted to do something, but I've been forced to reckon with the fact that nothing will happen as quickly as I want it to, especially if I want to avoid injuring myself further. This has pushed me to the opposite extreme where I feel like I can't do anything. I've had very little motivation to do anything, even indulge in my hobbies. I partially chalk it up to the weather. As soon as the sun comes back, I swear I'll have a little more zest for life, but waking up at 2 p.m. every day and spending what little of my time awake doing nothing isn't making me feel any better. This video is going to work as a jumping off point for one of my New Year's resolutions, which is to work on and share more about my non-fandom OCs. Like most artists, I have OCs and stories for them, but I don't really talk about them very much, even to my friends. I do intend for my projects to be fully realized either as a comic or whatever other medium I consider fitting and feasible, but I don't withhold information for fear of spoilers. I do it because my characters have been extremely inconsistent. I'm not totally precious with my ideas. If I think a change will improve what I have, I'll implement it, even if it means restructuring plot, characterizations, or world building around it. As such, when it comes to my oldest cast of characters, at the very least, they frequently change appearance, personality, or setting really drastically and seemingly without reason. I found it super unfair to ask for people's interest or investment in such unstable characters, so I stopped talking about them altogether. I don't think it's a bad thing to be able to discard my ideas when I find they don't work anymore, but it often resulted in taking down the foundations of a story before they're even properly set up. I'm really tired of taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back, so I'm hoping to commit a little more to my ideas moving forward. Making videos will work as a form of accountability and also to keep track of my progress. I don't think I'll end the year with all the pieces to start working on a full-fledged comic, but maybe I'll have a better idea on the characters or the outline of my story. I was going to talk about 2 stories, but I think the second one, I'll share a little info about it near the end, would benefit from having its own video, which can then be its own series separate from this one. Today, I'll be presenting my oldest cast of characters and the story they exist in. I find myself struggling to talk about the context of their creation because I've technically been working on their story for a little over 10 years. It feels important to talk about it for how much time that is, but ultimately all the material that I've built up over that amount of time is largely inconsequential to the story as it is now. So rather than explain my characters individually, I'll go over the story's evolution in broad strokes. For a very long time, these characters have always been some genre of fantasy. They started off as high fantasy, eventually going down to a slightly more grounded urban fantasy/supernatural setting. I had an idea for the characters' base personalities and the arcs I wanted them to go on, but for some reason, I struggled a lot with actually putting those arcs in motion. For every event I thought of, I didn't know how to string them together, and even then, I was mostly unconvinced with what I came up with. It came down to not knowing what I was trying to say. I became so focused on trying to do something with these characters that I never stopped to consider what they could represent. Not that every story needs to have a profound message, I just personally have an easier time when I have some sort of theme to guide me. I never properly rebuilt the foundations of my story every time I tore them down, so I realized I would need to properly start over. That said, I didn't know how to meaningfully restart something that never truly started. Going back to higher forms of fantasy didn't feel inspiring either because I had already moved away from them. It didn't feel sensible going back to settings I already struggled to develop. This led me to going in a drastically different direction: cyberpunk. You'll notice that I don't draw any sci-fi, and that's because I convinced myself for a long time that I was too stupid for it, and that being a fantasy artist meant that I wasn't allowed to do sci-fi. I've since realized that that line of thinking is completely ridiculous and limiting. I've always had a distant appreciation for the cyberpunk aesthetic, but I never really got into it for the aforementioned reasons. However, my lack of familiarity meant that I had no baggage with the genre, and that offered me a new freedom to explore things I hadn't previously considered. Plus, it offered a sense of novelty that would further motivate me to explore the world. Coupled with an increasing feeling of dread at the current state of affairs, a new idea sprang into my mind and I ran with it. I'd like to put a disclaimer that I am in the diaspora. I've never personally experienced a typhoon, volcanic eruption or earthquake, and all my family in the Philippines that I'm familiar with are largely in minimally impacted areas. At least my parents don't seem particularly worried whenever I ask about them. I have a lot of feelings about representation and questions of who has the right to tell what stories, but if I get into it now, the length of this video will become seriously bloated, so I'll leave that for another video. Or the comment section, I guess. In the meantime, let me actually talk to you about the new setting of my story. Reigning Champion takes place in a cyberpunk Philippines where funds and resources for environmental relief are won in a yearly fighting tournament. Each province sends a representative, the tournament acting as a place to celebrate cultural heritage and as a distraction from the intense typhoons of the wet season, or any other natural disasters that might hit during the year. I wish the title's pun worked in Philippine languages too. Anyway, I don't have very much in terms of world building besides some vague rules about the tournament itself. The fighters, obviously, must come from the province they represent and have human origins. It can't be a cyborg created purely for the sake of the tournament, although I haven't yet decided what percentage of human is necessary in order to qualify. For the time being, let's say having a human brain is a minimum requirement, but it can have undergone modifications. In order to protect the fighters' brains, at least, there are restrictions on how lethal their weapons can be. They probably would have developed technology that can cut through inorganic material but leave flesh and blood bits alone. I also imagine they would invest a lot in special effects, like crazy laser beams or explosives that would, in reality, cause minor injury to a squishy person. Accidents can happen, of course, but the general consensus is that nobody is supposed to come out of the tournament with a permanent, debilitating brain injury or dead. Anyway, I'm a character artist first and foremost. While I have other generally vague ideas regarding the world, it's all for the sake of being able to fit characters into them. To prevent this video from running too long and also to save me the trouble of having to make visuals for everyone, I'll mainly be talking about the three main characters. Starting off with the protagonist, Uran, who is the representative of Pampanga. He's the son of a former Kapampangan champion and nearly became champion himself, but something kept him from making it to the final confrontation. I'm not hiding what it is for the sake of suspense, I've genuinely yet to iron that out. But now he's back and he's not happy about it. His mother's run a clinic somewhere, I've yet to decide where exactly in Pampanga. But the government threatened to shut them down if they didn't provide in some manner to the tournament. An excuse, of course, the government just doesn't like what they're doing and needed a plausible reason to shut them down. Uran's parents want nothing to do with the tournament for their own reasons, so he decides to re-enter, which allows them to keep providing to the community back at home. Because of the way he went out the last time he competed, he knows he won't be well received if he announces his return. Not that he cares necessarily about how he's perceived, he just hates the media/spectacle aspect of the tournament. So he's one of the few, if not the only fighter who keeps his identity hidden. Even if other fighters have personas for the tournament, they are larger than life and engage in some shape or form with the public. Uran only ever shows up to fights, and when he does, he hides his face behind a mask and doesn't speak. Since the fighters are supposed to be celebrations of Philippine culture, they're generally going to have some sort of mythological or cultural inspiration, but I want Uran to be a bit of an outlier. He doesn't really want to be part of the spectacle, so my idea for the time being is that he's positioned himself as a judge. I'm playing with the idea that he's secretly also there to seek revenge, biding his time to cast a sort of final judgment on the tournament, hiding his intentions in plain sight. I've been largely unsure of how to represent that judgment, but part of me is thinking of leaning into Christianity. I'm Catholic, by the way, I'm allowed to do this, trust. Anyway, considering the importance of the Christian faith in the Philippines, it could also help to get his persona approved by the higher-ups. Otherwise, relating to lying to the public, he would also hide how much of himself is mechanical, allowing others to believe he has a mostly android body. Among the fighters, he's the least robotic, with only a mechanical eye that allows him to see the components of robotic structures. Other than that, he's all human, which is advantageous in a tournament where the most destructive weaponry targets mechanical bodies. Still, he has to be able to keep up with augmented fighters, so while he's still flesh and blood, he has enhanced physical capabilities and healing, courtesy of his mother. I haven't really figured out what's in his arsenal yet. While I do have some ideas, I'd like to share them when they're further thought out. The second character I'd like to talk about is Benilda. She's Uran's childhood best friend and had actually accompanied him the first time he entered the tournament. Back then, his mothers were there as his coach and doctor, Benny working as an assistant to the latter. When she was offered an opportunity to stay and further her studies/work in the capital, she took it, even if it meant leaving her friend for a system he abhorred. She doesn't know why Uran didn't make it to the finals, but she's made to believe it's due to his own caprice, and she hates him for it. If she knew the real reason, maybe she wouldn't have taken her promotion? I'm spitballing. Benny is all about self-preservation. I don't have the details of her backstory pinned down exactly, but I'm working off of the notion that she's a girl who came from nothing with something to prove. Uran's family really helped her find her footing, and as grateful as she is to them, that didn't keep them from being a stepping stone in her pursuit of success. Both her and Uran feel like cogs in a machine, but unlike Uran, Benny is gonna be the absolute best goddamned cog there is, believing it'll guarantee her safety and comfort. And it has so far. She comes into the story because Uran needs a doctor, but he can't rely on his mother if the goal is to keep her from returning to the tournament. And he has to be really particular about who he hires because he doesn't want anyone leaking his identity. Of course, the obvious and only option is his ex-best friend who he hasn't spoken to in several years following a major fallout. Either way, Benny is a professional. She understands strategically this was their best move. God knows she wasn't happy to see Uran again. She can't imagine the potential public outcry. And it's not a totally bad thing to be able to reconnect with an old friend. To ensure her own success, Benny has molded herself to fit the expectations of her peers. And it's an unexpected breath of fresh air to find herself in the company of someone who doesn't see her either as someone to undermine or someone to exploit. At the end of the day, their friendship breakup came from circumstance. Deep down, they still deeply care about each other. The final character I'd like to talk about is Alejandro, the fighter representing Sorsogon. They're also a bit of an outlier from other fighters because they don't really fit in with the spectacle part. They're polite and earnest. While they strive to do their best in the tournament, they're not particularly competitive. Alejandro genuinely believes in the good they can bring to their community by winning the tournament. I'm on the fence on whether or not this should be their first time entering. On the one hand, it would explain the fish out of water vibe they've got going on, but on the other, I feel like it could be interesting for a character to still genuinely believe in a system that has failed them before. But from their point of view, they're the one who failed. The system is totally fair and not rigged, after all. Either way, they're a relatively new fighter who, despite their rather subdued personality in contrast to their competitors, leaves a lasting impression on others. I also want Alejandro to be the only other fighter with no or extremely minimal mechanical augmentations. My reasoning for the grand majority of fighters having extensive robotic body modifications is that it allows for more spectacle and guarantees a consistent level of performance with less effort on the fighter to train or maintain their capabilities. I imagine also that because the engineering aspect of the tournament is so well invested, it may also be less costly for fighters to have mechanical bodies. Back to Alejandro, I'm still not sure what their theme is going to be. I'd love to tie in something specific to Sorsogon, but I've got to research local myths and folklore. If I can't find anything, I'm thinking of making them like an aswang because there's something really interesting about the most morally uncomplicated fighter's persona being the monstrous inversion of Filipino virtues. As for how Alejandro meets Uran and Benny, I'm still not entirely sure. What I do know is that Alejandro's current manager and the people responsible for his superhuman capabilities have history with Uran's mother. I already have some ideas for other characters, notably Uran's moms, his team, and some antagonists, but it might be for the best if I left them for a future video. For now, I'd actually like to share some worries I have relating to the story because I can't deal with them if I pretend they don't exist. And if I'm lucky, maybe someone will be willing to give me feedback or guidance. Of course, I need to do my due diligence and do my research, find references and the like, but stories are often enriched by different perspectives, and if I close myself off insisting that it's my responsibility to figure everything out, I lose the opportunity to learn things from other people. Anyway, unsurprisingly, my primary concerns are in regards to representation. The most obvious problem is the fighters. There are a lot of provinces in the Philippines, and that makes for a lot of things to look up and keep track of. I will say the idea for every province to have some mythological or cultural theme for their appearance and capabilities comes from the 2025 Miss Universe Philippines National Costume Competition, which also doubles as a reference for what theme I could use for certain representatives. Unfortunately for me, it doesn't cover every province, and some provinces appear multiple times because certain cities were featured, even if the province they belong to was already represented, which I don't plan on doing for the tournament. Tangentially related, the names of themes is going to be a pain to figure out. Ideally, I would want the fighters to have names relating to their respective regional languages, but I never even learned the languages of my heritage. While it's not totally impossible to find dictionaries in other languages, it certainly isn't easy, and I'm also going to assume that, like Tagalog, because that's the language I'm actively trying to learn right now, every Filipino language is highly contextual. Meaning that even if I did find a word in another language that should work, I'm not entirely sure if it means what I want it to in the context that I'm putting it in. Still kind of related to the fighters is the question of whether or not I'm going to represent indigenous peoples of the Philippines among them. And the answer is maybe? I'm not unaware of the struggles indigenous peoples in the Philippines are facing. I don't think they would benefit from me vaguely emulating their aesthetic for a background character. However, do I think that the tournament would co-opt their cultural heritage? Absolutely, but I don't want to make a character purely for the sake of critiquing cultural appropriation, especially in a story that is mostly focused on character drama, even if that drama is partially informed by politics. I'm certain that there are ways to go about this tactfully, but my knee-jerk reaction is to assume that I'll end up virtue signaling rather than actually saying something meaningful. My final major concern is in regards to faith. I mentioned before that I'm Catholic, but I wasn't raised very religiously. Religion is a very touchy subject, and while I'm not sure how I'm going to go about implementing it, the worst thing I can do is pretend that it doesn't exist. I mean, this is the Philippines. Despite how crazy we are about Christmas, Islam and indigenous animist beliefs also deserve to be acknowledged as important faiths in the country. The question is how to do that properly. Even as a Catholic, in theory, I don't know how I want Christianity to look in this story. I will say that I don't aim to critique religion. I don't really have anything to say about it in particular. I can always draw on my own experience with religion even if it is quite minimal, but I don't want all the characters I make to be some kind of Christian by default. All of these issues come down to who appears in the story and what I want them to do. I don't necessarily have to acknowledge all of these things if I don't want to, but I know that avoiding them is lazy, because what's the point of representation if I'm only picking the parts that are easy or beneficial for me? I promise I don't mean to beat you over the head about the representation thing, I just have mental illness about it. Next video will either be about solidifying Uran and Alejandro's abilities or introducing some side characters. Or maybe it'll be a third secret thing that Kurumi hasn't yet thought of. If you're interested in seeing where the story goes, please consider subscribing. I need people to hold me accountable. I've been procrastinating on writing for this story. I am once again struggling with figuring out the events, mostly in a timeline sense. Personally, I'm someone who's very slow to develop friendships with other people, and if I want Alejandro to form a very special, maybe more than friendship type of bond with Uran and Benilda, I either need to convince myself that those feelings can develop in a span of about a month, which is the estimated duration of the tournament, or I need them to somehow meet before, and if so, figure out how long ago that was. I don't know, maybe I'll have an idea by the time I make the next video. If you don't care about cyberpunk stories, I doubt you made it to this part of the video, but if you are here, maybe you'd be interested in my other story with the working title Study of Magic. It's a fantasy set in a world inspired by Spanish colonial era Philippines, where the main girl leaves her isolated mountain community when a new, unknown supernatural being starts harassing them. She finds her way into a magic school in the city in hopes that it'll give her answers she's looking for. I'm not sure when I'll make the first video for it, but hopefully it'll be soon. Anyway, besides actually developing my non-fandom stuff, my other art resolution is to continue drawing my OCs on their birthdays, which I did with my Genshin OCs in 2025 with varying degrees of success. I missed 2 of them and was late for, if memory serves, 3 of them. Obviously, I also want to improve as an artist, but that's nebulous and not a very whimsical resolution. Art block has been bumming me out. I want to focus on doing things that are fun and interesting rather than focusing on technical expertise. I'd also like to hear your New Year's resolution. If they're fun, maybe I'll steal them for myself, I don't know. We're at the end of the video. I'm unemployed, by the way. I don't know about doing YouTube as a career, but at least it's giving me something to do. That said, my channel's too small for ad revenue, so I'd really appreciate it if you checked out my Ko-fi, or subscribed and shared my stuff with others who might enjoy it. I think my video that has the most engagement is my Arcana one, and it drives me crazy. I'm sorry, Arcana fans, I'm not in the fandom anymore. Please watch my other things, pretty please. My voice is so much deeper and cooler now. If you like my art, you can follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky. I also have a website if you're not into social media. That's all. Thank you. Happy New Year. Bye bye.